And it's 3:30. This is Radio 4, and time for the radio programme, presented by Laurie Taylor.
Hello. Here's a very special pick of the week, an edited compilation from all the programmes which you could have heard just after midday last Monday on BBC Radios 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. In fact, that output, total silence on all networks, lasted a great deal longer than a few seconds, as engineers struggled with the broadcasting house circuit failure, which was eventually blamed on a so far unexplained break in one of their hundreds of connections and cables. Well, I'm no expert, but it sounds to me as if someone cut a wire. Anyway, you and yours eventually returned to Radio 4 at 12:06, followed closely by the Welsh Symphony Orchestra on Radio 3, The Roadshow on 1, Liz Kershaw on 5, and Jimmy Young and the Doctor on Radio 2. Those looking forward to the time when they could turn to a rolling news service for immediate information on such breakdowns should know that Radio 4 Longwave scrambled back on air last of all at 10 minutes past 12. Not that it was exactly a good week for news services which were already up and running.
This is Independent Radio News. IRN supplies national and international stories for over 20 million listeners to more than 90 UK radio stations, with updates 24 hours a day.
Last Wednesday came the announcement that the present nationwide IRN news service will no longer be provided by Crown Communications via the London Broadcasting Company, LBC, but by Independent Television News, ITN. This is quite a turnaround. Only 2 years ago on this programme we were announcing ITN's first move into radio news, its successful signing up of such stations as Jazz FM, Sunrise and WNK, and Crown Communications' irritated response that ITN was only able to move into this relatively unprofitable market because it could subsidise itself from its television interests. Well, all that debate turned out to be academic, when financial pressures at ITN led them to pull out of their radio news services early last year. But now comes the latest twist in the saga. Crown Communications, with losses of over £5 million for the 6 months to March 1992, are being forced to sell off existing assets. So, enter ITN with a successful takeover bid, a move which must now make them favourites to win the contract for the third independent national radio station. When James Herbert met Mervyn Hall, who will be chief editor of ITN's radio news, he began by asking if listeners to independent news would notice any change.
Well, I don't think they'll hear a considerable difference that would be obviously apparent. What I do hope that they'll see is that because we, being ITN, have a much greater spread, if you like, of news resources, I hope they'll find that our coverage and our bulletins have a little more breadth and have a wide range, perhaps a wider brief than before.
Obviously, with a bi-media environment, you get the advantages of the better resourced TV journalist setup all around the world. But how are you going to ensure that radio doesn't become the poorer cousin?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward. ITN Radio and the radio division which will be serving the contract for IRN will also have its own news gathering operation. It will have radio reporters. Where I think we have an advantage over the old IRN setup is that, let's take for example, if this afternoon John Major suddenly steps out of Downing Street and makes a statement of historic interest, we will actually have that material already coming in-house. We won't have to think in radio terms. First of all, how do we actually get John Major's voice? It will be already being done by another part of ITN.
That still sounds like a rather thinly veiled way of saying you'll perhaps just dub off video onto audio.
Well, we may well dub off the voice of John Major from the video, but I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I don't have a feel that necessarily the radio journalist has to physically have held the microphone in front of him, as long as he's the one who's elaborating on it and actually picking the story up and packaging it in a radio way.
When you were involved in radio news before in 1989, you didn't actually last that long in the game. What's to say that this time you'll be more successful, if you like?
Two things, I think. First of all, this time we have a specific contract of a specific length for a specific service. So we know effectively where our bread and butter is coming from. Secondly, last time round, the manifestation of our radio ambitions was the radio news service, but our aim was to look for ITN towards INR 3, the speech-based national licence, something incidentally that we still have a great interest in.
I just wonder whether you feel that the announcement by Michael Checkland last week about Radio 4 Longwave being all news has to an extent sort of spiked your ambition in terms of INR 3.
Well, that presupposes that all INR3 could ever be would be a rolling news format. Rolling news is certainly an element and certainly a very reasonable format to have for INR3, but it certainly isn't the only one. But I don't think you'd expect me to tell you what other formats that we have in mind for INR3.
Mervyn Hall talking to James Herbert. And while LBC hands over the news to ITN, strange things are happening at another London station. At the station which boasted in its campaigns that it would provide uninterrupted music. Radio, as the posters said, without the speakers.
Less talk means more great music, 7 days a week, here on Melody Radio, 104.9 FM.
3 weeks ago came the announcement that Melody Radio was hiring DJ David Jacobs to present a weekend summer show which would, quote, showcase the kind of music we do at other times of the week. It was not, they told us, a change of policy. And then, in the most recent survey of radio listening, the final one carried out by JICRA, came the even more surprising news that Melody Radio was registering a 5% fall in its audience reach, down from a high of 14% to a mere 9%. Well, that can only be good news for its chief competitor in London, Radio 2, and for all those who've insisted that radio without the speakers might eventually become radio without the listeners.
Radio 2 FM from the BBC.
Perhaps nobody embodies Radio 2's commitment to speech so well as John Dunn. Every weekday night from 5:05 to 7 p.m. on his own show, he plays music and talks, and talks. By my calculations, he's done around 3,000 interviews since his programme moved into its present slot 13 years ago. Whether, I asked him, any which were particularly memorable, for good or for bad reasons.
Well, the first startling point is I've never worked it out, but if you say that's the number, it's a bit staggering.
On the back of an envelope, I didn't.
It's very difficult, Laurie. I think that, people ask you, they say, who's the nicest person you've ever met? Best interviews have done, all this stuff. I don't really think I can answer that, ever, because A, it's in video, but also, I think when you're doing an interview, you look at it in a different way from the way people think we do it. They perceive it as a meeting of two people who are having a pleasant and amiable chat, but it's actually a professional job, and I set out to do an interview with certain aims and intentions. And really, the success of the interview at the end is dependent upon how well those aims or intentions have been met.
It's very difficult to define interviewing skills. You get people like Robin Day and Anthony Clare and Sue McGregor, all with very different techniques. But if I were to ask you to describe your technique, what are the key elements?
Well, I think the most important thing, first of all, as you say, there are different interview techniques for different purposes. The one thing I'm not ever out to do is to trip somebody up. I mean, I've been accused of calling my programme unashamedly bland in the past, and I actually stick by it, because at that time of the day, there's plenty of aggro going on Radio 4, if you'll pardon my saying so, at that time of the day normally. We're a sort of antidote to it in a way. And I just like the idea that there are actually in the world pleasant people talking about reasonably pleasant topics. And if there's something which comes up that demands that you tangle with the person, I would rather not do it.
I mean, I get the feeling from all this that you don't really like the idea of being a personality, despite the fact that you've won Radio Personality of the Year several times.
Well, I don't think it's the interviewer's job, honestly, to be a personality. I think it's there are plenty. Well, again, you come back to types of interview. Nobody would deny that the Wogan type of interview, he is more important, probably, to that contest than his interviewee. And my type of interviewing is not that. I actually think that I am less important in the context of the enjoyment of the listener than the person on the other side of the table. I would much rather, if you like, sit back a bit and say to somebody else, come on, do a dance.
Is this something which influenced your decision not to take over? You were offered the job of, after Roy Plumley died, of taking over Desert Island Discs. You turned it down. Why?
Well, no, it wasn't for that reason. It's purely and simply that there isn't really the time, I didn't think, to do Desert Island Discs as well.
If you had taken that job, it would have taken you from what I think Russell Twisk in a recent article talked about as the great unloved network of Radio 2. It would have taken you from Radio 2 to Radio 4, wouldn't it? I mean, do you occasionally feel you're not noticed enough? I know you don't want to be a personality, but the Radio 2 just doesn't get quite the attention perhaps it deserves.
On behalf of all Radio 2 listeners and presenters, no, I know what Russell means about that. I'll tell you what it is. I think it's the fact is that you can, there is a sort of genuine reason for all the other networks. One has to listen to Radio 1 or be aware of it because, the children Noisy music, can't take that stuff. And of course everybody listens to Radio 3. I mean, naturally, the cultivated person obviously listens to Radio 3. And Radio 4, well, one must keep in touch with the news and world around us. It's such a good network too, isn't it? There isn't actually a target for Radio 2, except that people listen to it. That's why it appears to be a neglected network. It's a very difficult network to criticize as well. It's very difficult to write a column around Radio 2 because a lot of it is based on the similarities of everyday's patterning. You know, it's a difficult network to promote and a difficult network to pigeonhole.
Just looking through the records, it seems you've had your own radio show, albeit at different times of the day, since 1966, which makes 26 years altogether. I mean, do you ever get the feeling now that you might be going in a different direction to Radio 2? I mean, what I mean is Radio 2 is consciously looking towards younger listeners, and yet you chronologically are bound ever onwards.
I think people make, I think, a terrible mistake about radio programs, particularly national network radio programs, about trying to pigeonhole exactly who the audience is, particularly for a network like Radio 2. I have a sort of pet theory that the country is big enough that if you can put out a program which is compulsive listening for red-haired dwarves or something, there are enough red-haired, vertically challenged people in Britain to make up an audience. And I think one of the worst things that we ever did, as a matter of fact, in recent years was actually to specify that Radio 2 had an age target for an audience, because I don't like being reminded of my advancing years. And I don't think other people do either. Say, this is a program for you and you're doting. I mean, I think that's a dreadful thing to say. The fact of the matter is, the audience is extremely wide. We do actually, obviously, have a number of retired, older listeners, whatever, but we also have a large number of younger listeners, and anyone looking at the mailbag would immediately see it.
John Dunn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You might like to know that this week's John Dunn Show on Radio 2 comes from Lisbon, part of a series of visits to EC capitals which he's undertaking this year in the last week of every month. It's perhaps a pity that Vienna isn't yet an EC capital. John would have felt quite at home there if he'd twiddled his radio dial and discovered Blue Danube, the station which not only presents a Radio 2 sound-alike compilation of melodic and classical music, magazine programmes, features and news and travel, but which also broadcasts for 19 hours a day in English. Back in 1979, when ORF, the Public Broadcasting Service in Austria, started the station, it was intended mainly for the international community in Vienna. But so popular was Blue Danube that in May this year it was renamed Europa Radio and began broadcasting to the entire country. Only the news headlines use any other language than English, and all the presenters, who do 3-week stints at a time, are native English speakers. Station controller is Tilia Herold.
Seen and heard around Blue Danube Radio. That was Henry Mancini, and you probably recognised it as the Baby Elephant Walk.
We look at the arts, we look at sciences, we look at lifestyles, we look at people, and I think it's very interesting for people who can understand English to get a wider viewpoint. I think it's a very brave decision in a German-speaking country to have a foreign language program broadcast for the natives to the natives. Bear in mind that if the BBC were to open a 6th network and broadcast in German, I'm sure there would be a huge outcry.
Blue Danube Radio.
The focus has shifted to bringing more of Europe into Austria by emphasis on the music content, on a correspondence network, and buying the best of European broadcasting and retransmitting it here, just to give people a taste of what is happening in other radio stations all over the continent.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful being a foreign presenter on Austrian radio. The kudos one gets in Austria compared to what one gets in Australia is significantly different. The usual contract's a 21-day contract. It's a way of making sure that the station doesn't end up with an American identity or a British identity or indeed even an Australian identity. There is a bureaucratic consideration, of course, too. We don't have to have work permits if we work for the 21 days here. you do your 21 days, then you're expected to leave the country, and if you're invited back, well and good. People know that is the nature of Blue Danube, that people you hear on the radio are itinerants. And I suppose, in a way, there's an expectancy that you will bring a little bit of your own country to the radio. But there's no problem whatsoever being a foreigner. We're working on an English-speaking radio station in the middle of Europe.
Well, the Munich Opera Festival opened tonight with a performance.
I suppose it could be argued it is distracting to the audience, but the continuity is provided by the editorial team that is resident in Austria. The presenters are very much just presenters. You are the voice on the radio. Scripts are written for you, programs are produced, research is done by a team that is based in Austria. So the content of the programs would never change. Okay, the voice that delivers that program changes on a 3-week basis, and it might be quite a radical change of accent. So you'd hope the quality of that program wouldn't change too much on a 3-week basis. Maybe just the voice would change.
Hello, Barry Redfern here. Welcome to Today at 1. We'll be looking at Egyptology, especially the Egyptian exhibition that's currently on show at the Kunstler.
English is the lingua franca. That has been accepted. We are not a British radio station. We're not an Australian or New Zealand radio station. We use English as a common denominator language to entertain and to inform.
So it's time for me to say goodbye. I'll be back tomorrow morning between 9 and 1. I'll leave you to the sounds of part of the intermezzo from Cavalleria Rusticana by Mascagni.
Blue Danube Radio with station controller Tilia Herold and Australian presenter Chris Wisby. Those 5 seconds of music were about the nearest this programme ever got to having a jingle, but a few dozen protesting letters were enough to make us rethink. Since way back in the 50s, jingles have properly been reserved for music radio, regarded as a potentially irritating but essential way of announcing station and programme identity. But despite British radio's love of the form, most jingles you'll hear on the air still originate in the States, and particularly Dallas. I can still recall Radio York having to send back samples from there which hymned the beauties of a county called Yorkshire. Mairead Devlin begins her report on the phenomenon with a visit to Britain's newest commercial station, Radio Wave in Blackpool, where Steve England, who is an agent for the Dallas company, Jams, was busy trying to sell the controller, Simon Tate, a suitable jingle package.
First of all, let me play you this, because I don't think this is quite right, but at least we'll get to eliminate something.
Somewhere, I guess, haven't we?
More music. Let's talk Friday FM 103 WLTE.
You're right.
Yeah, well,
not what we're looking for.
Right, well, I thought I'd better play that first. That's a bit too Radio 2 for you.
Yes, I think it is, yeah.
Well, perhaps what you're looking for, rather than sort of brass and strings and that kind of thing, is maybe what we call machine music, which is like synthesizers and sequence stuff.
I don't think I know what I'm looking for, but I'll know it when I hear it, so you play it.
Jingles might be the last thing you notice when you listen to the radio, but they're often the first thing you remember. According to Mike Powell, chief executive of the independent station Pirate FM, the jingle can make or break a new venture.
The jingle is the single most crucial element in developing the on-air station corporate image of a radio station. Their importance cannot be underestimated. It's the kind of thing where when a new radio station goes on the air, in a couple of weeks after the station goes on air and you're driving a marked radio station car and you stop at traffic lights, the kids will sing out at you the logo of a radio station.
SX Radio.
They're a great way of staging transitions between music. If, for example, you want to play records back to back, well, okay, but a better way of doing that is to keep reinforcing the identity of the radio station. If you can do it with a short, sharp musical jingle, which also helps to ease the transition from, say, a fast record to a slow record, or vice versa, then a jingle is a very good way of doing that.
Although jingles are now part of the furniture on most radio stations, they almost came about by accident. Jam's agent in Britain, Steve England.
The whole jingle industry started in 1951 in Dallas, Texas, and it was basically because a radio station called KLIF had its own orchestra. And the man who owned that, a man called Gordon McClendon, suggested that they make some little songs for the radio station. They made them, they were very successful, and some of the people from the orchestra decided to set up recording these jingles for other radio stations that perhaps didn't have their own orchestras.
Up until the mid-1980s, the Broadcasting Act made it difficult for radio stations to go outside Britain for their jingles. But then the now-defunct IBA changed its view of the legislation, and since then stations have been beating a path to the American jingle producers. Mike Powell from Pirate FM again.
When the rules were relaxed and we were allowed to use American-based product for the first time, you saw a mass exodus, virtually, because everyone in the commercial sector wanted to emulate the quality of the jingles which people heard on Radio 1 and Radio 2. And for that, there is only one place, the mecca of the jingle, is Dallas.
Currently, 85% of the jingles we hear are made in Dallas, and Radio Wave in Blackpool has just been added to the list. Having identified the jingle program controller Simon Tate likes, Steve England tries to give him some idea of what the finished product will sound like.
The thing I can't imagine is how are our lyrics going to fit in with those beds?
Well, let me just show you the first cut here, which is cut number 1. I'll just play it through and have a listen. Blackpool's Tower of Power, 96.5 Radio Wave. I mean, it won't be as stilted as that. I'm not a singer.
Yes, you're not. No. Okay, so that's how it's going to sound.
Yeah.
So that's one. Yeah.
So we'll move on to the next one.
But can jingles created for American outlets really sit well on British radio? Apart from any cultural differences, stations here have a much broader music base than their American counterparts, and in turn their jingles are very specific. But Steve England says that isn't a problem.
Radio stations can get by that by selecting from several packages. So, for example, if they play quite a wide range of music, they can select from what we would call an AC package, which is adult contemporary music. Then they will also choose from what we would call a CHR package, a contemporary hit radio package, which will be appealing to sort of 15-year-olds. And that way they can get a spread which covers all the kinds of music they play.
But Mark Woodman from Air Force, one of the few companies making jingles in Britain, accuses the American jingle market of being stuck in a time warp.
The problem we see with the American produced product, which is, very slickly done, very polished and all those things, but it does tend to follow a very similar philosophy, particularly the vocal treatment, which produces a very distinctive sound. Well, that's fine and all well and good, but that sound can't be right for everybody, surely. They have these big block harmonies. Well, when was the last time you heard a record that had a 7-part harmony in it, that went out with doo-wop or the Beach Boys or something? It's just, you don't hear vocal sounds like that.
That's a very, very good point, but if you think about it, apart from solo performances, there are very few musical forms that don't have some element of harmony. On the other hand, the difficulty of making jingles which sound very contemporary is that means they go out of date very quickly. A jingle has to stand the test of time if you're going to get any payback on your investment.
So what sort of stations are buying British now? Mark Woodman again.
It's stations that can't find what they're looking for in America, particularly in markets that are very have a large number of radio stations, because there's all the more reason to want to stand out. And people who find that in programming terms the jingles don't work. They don't make the connections between the news and the music or the speech content or whatever happens to be their programming.
One of those customers is the BBC's local radio station for London, GLR.
The radio station's programming adult rock, fairly sophisticated music on the whole, and they wanted to reflect that with jingles that had the sorts of sounds, production values, instrumentation that you would hear on the records that they play. And on the GLR package, we're using solo vocalists because they are producing more of a performance, more personality, which is what you get when you hear a record, you hear a performance.
Choosing a jingle package to create an identity for your radio station is one thing, but knowing how to use it effectively is another. Mike Powell says that some stations perhaps miss the point.
it's much more of a production tool. I hesitate to say art form because that's elevating it beyond its status, but it's a much more important production tool than people have hitherto thought. And I think we're getting better at it, but sometimes you do hear radio stations where the jingles clearly don't really match the nature of the radio station.
As more layers of stations come in, it's going to be very important for the new stations to actually think what we really want to sound like. The problem is that some of them, having a jingle package is like sort of, it's proving you've arrived, and I've known of stations that have actually bought the jingle package before they've even appointed a programming controller, because it's like, we're real now, we've got a jingle package. And the fact that the jingle package might not fit what they actually end up doing is sort of, seems to be subsidiary.
But at Radio Wave, everything has been sorted out. The music policy is in place, the jingle package has arrived, and programme controller Simon Tate is delighted.
I'm stunned. Incredible. I mean, I just couldn't imagine what it was going to sound like with our station name on it from hearing those original American ones.
That's often difficult, but I mean, these guys have been doing it for 30 years in Dallas, so it's the world centre for jingles, and
So
they know how to do it.
It does sound like that as well. It's great.
And the sound that's made him so delighted?
The Wave! Blackpool's Tower of Power. 96.5 Radio Wave.
Mairead Devlin reporting. Or as she's now known in Dallas, Mairead Devlin. This is the last in the present series of the radio programme, but in case you're overcome by a desperate longing for more radio facts and fancies before we return at the end of October, let me tell you about BH92, BH being short for Broadcasting House. This was announced back in April as a spectacular multimedia stage show and exhibition to mark 70 years of radio broadcasting. It would, said the handout, be an exciting evocation of radio past, present and future. The reality, which is available to the public at BH from August the 22nd, £3.50 for adults, £2.50 concessions, £10 for a family ticket, seems marginally less extravagant. But for your money you will have access to the Heritage Corridor designed by Neil Potter, an internal marquee housing a Radio Today exhibition, and the grand centrepiece, an audio-visual show called Worlds of Sound, created and directed by John Powell.
The show is framed, really, by the figures of Prospero and Ariel. Prospero and Ariel are very distinguished pieces of sculpture that, in fact, adorn the front of Broadcasting House by Eric Gill. And I've, in a way, lifted those figures off the front of Broadcasting House and brought them inside into this magic black box. And Prospero, out of the eye of the storm, summons Ariel, and through him they evoke the whole world, the history of sound. And we take you on a journey back in time to the early days of broadcasting, to Savoy Hill, to the early days of Broadcasting House, through to World War II, and all the marvellous correspondence and their pieces, the D-Day landings, the war in Europe, the Blitz on London. We bring you through into the present through comedy, through the Goons, through Tony Hancock, through to the future, where we kind of take off into space. We go off on a journey in a rocket ship out into the unknown. This is very much a multimedia show. Every kind, everything to stir and stimulate the imagination.
Certainly sounds as though it will have the edge on brass rubbing at Westminster Abbey. Whatever you do, have a wonderful summer. Goodbye.
The radio programme was presented by Laurie Taylor and the producer was Emma Selby. In a few minutes after the news analysis, and then in Dust Devils, Vaughan Purvis goes on a pilgrimage to the moon. In a secret and holy place on the coast of Morocco, he's taken to see a deranged inmate of a cliffside mental asylum. It's a former English professor whose demons are said to be driven out by the high tides of the full moon. Dust Devils is at 5:15 here on Radio 4.
BBC News at 4 o'clock. The South African government has promised an investigation into allegations that the country's police are routinely killing people in their custody. The claims from a leading pathologist, Dr. Jonathan Gluckman, have also prompted condemnation from the ANC. From Johannesburg, Fergal Keane.
The ANC's initial reaction has been to denounce the police treatment of detainees as barbaric. saying Dr. Gluckman's statement confirmed what the organisation had long suspected and placed serious question marks over President de Klerk and his cabinet. The Ministry of Law and Order has ordered an immediate inquiry into all deaths in custody over the past 2 years. The ministry spokesman, Captain Craig Costa, described Dr. Gluckman's allegations as startling, but rejected any suggestion that the police were out of control, as the doctor alleged. In an interview with the BBC, Dr. Gluckman said he was a strong supporter of President de Klerk, but had decided to go public out of a sense of frustration and despair.
United Nations officials in Bosnia have decided to abandon efforts to send food supplies to the besieged town of Gorazda, where the population of 70,000 is said to be facing starvation. The decision has been taken following an ambush of a convoy which tried to reach the town but became stuck in a minefield. Labour's newly appointed Treasury spokesman Gordon Brown has condemned the government for complacency in its approach to the economy after the Chancellor predicted that a recovery would materialise. Mr. Brown said that Mr. Lamont's comments would anger thousands of people who are facing the prospect of losing their jobs or seeing their businesses collapse because of the government's inaction. The Catholic Archbishop of Liverpool, the Most Reverend Derek Warlock, is said to be making a good recovery from an operation yesterday to remove a cancerous lung. The spokesman for his archdiocese has said he's in good spirits. Sport in motor racing, Nigel Mansell is on course to become the world champion, having won the German Grand Prix in Hockenheim. With 6 more races left in the season, he needs only 1 more to secure the title. And in cycling, Miguel Indurain of Spain has won the Tour de France for the 2nd year running. BBC Radio News.
But certainly I think Graham Gooch is the main influence at the moment, because as he has shown in the first innings with that big 100, the whole England batting sort of centres around him. And it would have been really interesting had had that decision of run out gone in Pakistan's favour, because obviously we saw it in the slow motion and we knew that only after seeing in that at that speed that Gooch was out, the luxury which the umpires don't have. But certainly that run out decision which Pakistan would feel that had that gone in their decision, probably this would have been much more tighter situation than it is at the moment. But David Gower, of course, another experienced cricketer and one of the most brilliant batsmen I think England has got. I mean, I'm a great Gower fan, and I'm sure millions of others are. And anybody who can score 8,000 runs with the flourish, the style and the classic way that he plays, I'm sure pinning their hope and faith to see that Gower in company with Graham Gooch get these runs.
Yes, I can't argue with that. An unfortunate blemish perhaps, that run out. And away goes Akram now and bowls to Gower, who turns that away on the onside and can take a single. Goes just behind square, and Asif, who's taken his helmet off, feels the ball, so Gower has 1 more. He goes to 7. 47 for 2.
And Wasim Akram changed ends, bowling from the football ground.
Yes, which I think might suit him a little bit more. I think we were chatting earlier on, weren't we?
Yes.
At the back of the box, with the breeze suiting Akram just to bring the ball back into Gooch, and certainly to claim an LBW, and he had plenty of shouts earlier on from the far end. He'll have more chance now, I think, of just straightening the ball up a little bit, which should give him a chance.
Yes, and it'll be interesting to see whether Javed is going to keep Mushtaq bowling from the other end or bring Waqar Yunus.
Akram it is, who bowls to Gooch at short. He turns that away just in front of Zahid Fazl, who's now wearing the helmet at short mid-wicket.
That's right, that's Zahid, who took that catch to dismiss Robin Smith.
It seems that he's the expert under there for the quicker bowlers, and Asif crouches in there for the slow ones. A big man,
yes, he
Fazl,
is.
to be wearing a helmet and crouching in that close position, but there he is at short mid-wicket as Akram bowls a short one to Gooch, which he dabs down on the offside all the time in the world just to get up on his toes and play it on the back foot. And Asif fields at point. There's 1 slip, and that's all close catching behind Graham Gooch, apart of course from the keeper. Short mid-wicket. And a deep square leg, a deep fine leg, and a deep third man as Akram turns and runs up the hill to bowl to Graham Gooch, who steers it into the offside. He won't get a run as Asif moves around to his right. Asif Shoaib is still being banished to his position at deep square leg.
In fact, Shoaib himself is a very good fielder, and people always talk about him as being an ideal cricketer because he can bowl a little bit, bowl off spinners, he's a very good bat and a brilliant fielder.
Akram again from over the wicket, bowls to Gooch. He's beaten outside the off stump, sparring at that one. Not a very good stroke the ball angled across him, good length. Gooch didn't quite get his feet moving to that one. But it passed safely. It's past the outside edge.
Yes, that's the angle I think which did it. Gooch had to play because it was angled across him and beaten by that angle.
Akram turns again, only a short run, and bowls to Gooch, who finds the middle of the bat for this one, is moving across into line. And it's Mushtaq who bustles in from cover to field. That's the end of Akram's over. England 47 for 2, Gooch has 30, and Gower has 7. Something to see, looks as Mushtaq.
Yes, Mushtaq is, he will. I think just before tea, the 1 over he bowled, David Gower faced only 1 ball. And I think in that he played across the line, and Mushtaq was quite excited about the fact that he beat Gower in the air, because first he was looking to sweep and then finding the ball pretty close to him, played virtually with a straight bat into the square leg position. With the rough created by the bowlers, for David Gower, I think it will be a really hard task to cope with this leg spinner.
Here comes Mushtaq bowling to Gower, who drives that firmly on the offside, and it hits Fazal at silly point. I saw something that I hope I didn't see as the wicketkeeper changed ends, and I'm not going to say anything unless it happens again.
Drop of rain, maybe?
No, it was something that I certainly saw Mohan Khan do. Whether it's by accident or not, I don't know, but I'm not saying any more at this stage. Mushtaq bowls to Gower, who goes on the back foot and throws it out in the offside. And it's fielded at cover, and there's no run. Right, there, a rough outside Gower's off stump is there, and it sort of grown as the game continues. 47 for 2. Crowd growing a little restless. Mushtaq comes from around the wicket and bowls to Gower, who comes forward. A walking stroke. The ball ends up on the onside. Mushtaq himself fields. Gower has 7. There's a short leg, a silly point and a slip. England need 52 to win. 8 wickets in hand. The rest of the field is set pretty deep. And here comes Mushtaq around the wicket. He bowls to Gower, who gets a full length ball, almost a full toss. He drives it into the offside. There's no run. A little overcast again. I think we've been very lucky with the weather so far today. It's a very good forecast. No interruptions so far. Mushtaq comes around the wicket and bowls to Gower again. That's a full toss, and it's clipped to Javed at mid-wicket. Straight to him. And there's no run. Still a strong breeze going straight across the ground. And the crowd certainly has grown during the day as Mushtaq bowls to Gower, who plays and misses at that one outside the off stump. It ends Mushtaq's over.
A very good one too.
47 for 2.
He certainly beat Gower in that last delivery that he bowled, and I think unfortunately for Javed, obviously he would like to crowd the batsman, especially when he has the luxury of using the leg spinner, but because he hasn't got those many runs, he cannot really put the fielders around the batsman to crowd him and to put more pressure, because he also has to see that those 52 runs are not scored very easily. He has to defend that small target.
Yeah, it's not easy at all to set a field. Wasim Akram goes over the wicket and bowls to Graham Gooch, who goes on the back foot and plays it out towards the Pakistan captain, Javed, who's at mid-off. It is difficult, isn't it, not knowing quite where to put your men. The ball's hardly carried to slip throughout the match, so he's quite justified in just having the one. A lot of fielding teams fancy picking up Graham Gooch at short mid-wicket. Akram bowls to Gooch, who pushes forward to that one. And again, it's Javed who fields at mid-off. Very black clouds heading over the back, this message reads. And we can't see from here, but that's the direction the weather would be coming from. The rain has been forecast. I think we were quite lucky earlier on. A huge bank of cloud went around the left-hand side of the ground. Now field change. What's happening? Javed's going into catching position on the offside, about 5 yards or so from Graham Gooch's bat. And Akram bowls to Gooch, who hits it straight to him, but bouncing well in front of him.